The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints says it is politically neutral,
Neutral enough to sue a podcast over a logo.
but not neutral enough to send so much as a strongly worded letter to a political group that put the Salt Lake Temple in its campaign ad.
One of those things got a federal lawsuit.
The other got a press release asking people to please not get the wrong idea.
Guess which one used the church's actual name, actual leaders, and actual temple?
Hello, Eternal Family. Welcome to Post-Mormon Postmortems, Mormon Monday, where we look at something happening in Mormondom and ask what it says about the bigger system. I'm Jess.
And I'm Hannah. Today's episode is really two stories, and they only make sense side by side. Story one, the actual relationship between the church and the Trump administration in 2026, which multiple outlets describe as a widening divide, not an alignment. Story two, the church's trademark lawsuit against the Mormon Stories podcast, sitting right next to an unofficial political group called Latter-day Saints for Trump, which has used church imagery, church leaders' photos, and the actual Salt Lake Temple image for 2 election cycles without so much as a cease and desist.
So, the spine of this episode is who does the church actually go after and who does it let slide?
Exactly. Institutional neutrality is the claim. Selective enforcement is the pattern. Let's start with the divide, because people might assume the church and the Trump administration are cozy right now, and that's not what the reporting really shows. Jana Reese wrote a piece for Religion News Services syndicated in the Salt Lake Tribune called The Growing Divide Between the Trump Administration and the LDS Church.
Yeah, that headline alone undercuts the closely aligned idea.
Right, Exhibit 1. On May 17th, 2026, the White House backed a national mall event called Rededicate 250, meant to rededicate America to God and, quote, conservative Christian values. There were no LDS leaders on the stage, none, despite the fact that most U.S. Mormons are Republican.
Right. That's a pointed absence. And as an aside, I live in DC. Nobody showed up to that stage there, except for the people on it. There was not a big audience there.
Yeah, so maybe not too much enthusiasm.
Mm-mm.
Yeah, so Reese called it a widening divide between the church's priorities and the administration's, and it's not a one-off. The same week as that event, the church donated $25 million to UNICEF for maternal and child nutrition programs, right as the Trump administration had gutted USAID funding.
That's a very specific kind of message.
And here's a detail that wasn't even in our original notes. The donation is being matched dollar for dollar by the Bezos family, bringing the total impact to $50 million for UNICEF's Child Nutrition Fund.
Wow. So that's not just a quiet donation. It's a quiet donation that doubled itself.
Right. And thank God the church is doing something with all their billions. And Reese's line, her point is, she says, quote, the pointed emphasis on charitable giving feels like the politest and most quintessentially Mormon FU ever to the administration, close quote. She's like,
wow, did not expect a religion news service columnist to say that, but totally respect it.
Exactly. It's like you really stick it to someone by giving $25 million to charity.
Mm.
And we're here for that. There's more. In late February 2026, the church put out a statement on Iran that was notably non-committal. This ran under the headline, Church Statement on the Evolving Situation in Iran. So that's how we know it was about Iran, because the text itself never talks about a country or a leader. It has, quote, profound concern and heartfelt compassion for all those living in harm's way, close quote. Read by some as a deliberate refusal to take Trump's side.
Yeah, I can see how they read it that way because it's vague on purpose.
Yeah, and then there's the semi-quincentennial stuff. The church backed the bipartisan America 250 Commission rather than Trump's own branded effort, which he called Freedom 250. And observers flagged that as a pointed choice.
Right. Choosing the boring bipartisan commission over the guy's personal brand. Again, it's its own kind of statement.
Yeah. And then there's the Muslim outreach angle, which I think is really interesting in this moment. On February 9th, 2026, Elder Christoph Gerard Carrier, a church leader over Africa Central, he visited a mosque in Nairobi, Kenya, and told the leaders of the mosque, quote, "You can count on us to be emissaries of the goodness of Islam, the religion, and the teachings of the Prophet." Close quote. That's a direct contrast to the anti-Muslim rhetoric that comes from Trump and his allies.
And in March 2026, Mormons co hosted iftar dinners in the Sydney and Brisbane areas, including one with Affinity Intercultural Foundation and one at the Mubarak Mosque in Camp Hill. They opened a meeting house in Campbelltown for an Eid al-Fitr gathering and joined faith groups at the Manila Golden Mosque and Cultural Center in the Philippines, where the church donated bread to the local Muslim community. So, on immigration adjacent, religious minority adjacent messaging, the church is leaning the opposite direction from the administration's rhetoric.
That's the pattern. I mean, have you ever seen the church do outreach in Muslim communities?
Never.
Personally, no. Personally, never.
Mm-mm.
I don't devour the church news like my parents do. So what do I know? So yeah, I mean, the pattern is right that they're diverting. Right, they're clearly demonstrating without stating that maybe they're not so interested in being aligned. And to be fair, it seems like maybe it's one sided. Trump himself is obviously still courting the Utah Mormon vote, right? Like he is counting on that. The Salt Lake Tribune's Mormon Land Roundup mentioned Trump referring to a favorite Mormon. That was his quote for healthcare leadership. His favorite Mormon he had in mind. So the White House clearly still wants closer alignment, or at least that's the impression.
Right. But it's just not being reciprocated institutionally. And I want to flag one thing before we move on, because as everyone listening knows, Hannah and I try to be really careful about sourcing on this show. So a listener mentioned a claim that they'd seen online that the church has an official statement talking about praying for Trump and being closely aligned with the administration. But we looked and we couldn't find any church sponsored forum that said that.
So what's that based on?
Well, the only church statement in that kind of neighborhood is standard boilerplate from the November 6, 2024 message congratulating Trump on winning and inviting members to pray for him. That's routine language that the church uses for any newly elected leader, not administration specific alignment. So, my best guess is people are conflating that with the second thing we're talking about today, which is an unofficial group called LDS for Trump, which is not the church.
But is a perfect transition because that group is the second half of this episode, and I've got some details. Latter-day Saints for Trump, found at ldsfortrump.com, is an unofficial political coalition, not a church entity. It launched in August 2020. It was co-chaired by former Senator Orrin Hatch and Cindy Biggs, who is the wife of Andy Biggs, I think is his name. He's a state representative. It was officially paid for by the organization Donald J. Trump for President, Inc., and Mike Pence spoke at the launch event in Mesa, Arizona.
Okay, so far that's just normal campaign outreach to a religious voting bloc.
Sure, except the group's early ad used the Salt Lake Temple as the backdrop for a photo of its 18-member advisory board.
The actual temple, not a stock photo of a generic steeple or church?
No, the actual specific sacred edifice. Members called it super inappropriate online. That photo was pulled and replaced with a photograph of Mike Pence.
Oh, sure, because there was backlash. That's why.
Yes, you know how the church be responding to backlash
Mhm.
sometimes. So the organization, it relaunched for 2024, and a draft version of the campaign website briefly went live, featuring an image of Trump alongside President Russell M. Nelson and President Henry B. Eyring, pulled from Trump's 2017 Welfare Square visit.
Wait, so we have the actual sitting first presidency right next to Trump on a campaign website.
On a campaign website. Mhm. And that is a more direct implication of institutional endorsement than anything ever alleged against Mormon Stories podcast.
Wow. Okay, Hannah, say that again for the people in the back.
While it is just an implication, it is a more direct implication of institutional endorsement than anything alleged against Mormon Stories. And we'll come back to that.
Wow. Wow. So what else did this group do?
So while I wouldn't encourage you to go and watch it because I value your time, on October 13th, 2024, they ran a virtual fireside where Trump called in personally from his plane, speaking for about 10 minutes. There was Senator Mike Lee who spoke, Representatives Burgess Owens and Celeste Malloy, Glenn Beck himself,
Mm.
radio host and gold storer extraordinaire was there, and others whose names you might recognize, like Andy Biggs, whose wife is the co-chair. Okay, so explicitly targeted at LDS voters in swing states, Arizona and Nevada, right? Because that's Utah, that's a given. But these swing states are where you can really make a difference. Trump told the group that he shares the same values as Latter-day Saints. He might. I kind of believe it. Okay? Family, parental rights, and religious freedom.
Whew, let me compose myself. But I'm gonna say, and they use the word fireside, right? That word
Yeah.
is not neutral in the Mormon context.
No. You know, when many of us or non-Mormons hear fireside, the first thing that I think of is like FDR's famous fireside chats during the war. But to Mormons, the word fireside is much more likely to be tied to church culture, and that was used on purpose.
I'm sure it was.
Okay, so Latter-day Saints for Trump. They occasionally sell branded merchandise like hats and t-shirts with, the branding Latter-day Saints for Trump on it. And they actually do it through Trump's own store. It's the Donald Trump store that sells their merchandise. They don't have their own online store. It's through Trump's website. Their website features a mission statement which says the coalition seeks, quote, to unite Latter-day Saints in preserving the moral and ethical values that strengthen families and communities. Grounded in the teachings of the Family Proclamation to the World, which emphasizes the sacred nature of family as the fundamental unit of society, this coalition stands firm in its mission to promote policies that safeguard these values. The mission statement continues, through faith, service, and resilience, we stand together to defend the freedoms that allow religious communities to thrive and ensure a brighter future for all. Close quote. As our listeners likely know, The Family, A Proclamation to the World, is a 1995 declaration from the First Presidency and Quorum of the 12. And in the 30 years since its publication, the Church has treated it as core doctrine.
Okay, wait. My political colors are gonna come through a little bit here. This is the church aligning themselves with the man, 3 times divorced, who had an affair while married to one, who had an affair while his current wife was nursing their baby. This guy, and he represents family values.
Allegedly.
Soapbox. I'm pushing that aside. Okay, because they're not borrowing vibes anymore, right?
No.
They're citing church scripture as a campaign platform here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, because Jess, if you say it, you can make it so, right?
Oh,
I mean,
wow.
if people are willing to
Yeah.
believe it. But listen, more about the merch, because this is its own small comedy, and The Atlantic wrote a really scathing and funny article about it. In October 2024, the campaign put up a Latter-day Saints for Trump coffee mug for sale, cheap at $25, without considering the optics of selling a coffee mug to Mormons. They got mocked all over social media and then quietly relabeled it just mug.
Wow. So somewhere a campaign staffer found out what the word wisdom is in real time, right? It's always the staffer. It's always the intern.
Yeah, for sure. Someone had to get the blame. Every single time across both the 2020 and 2024 election cycles, and possibly a third event later this year, America 250, the church's response has been the same. In 2020, they put out a statement that the church, quote, does not endorse, promote, or oppose political parties, candidates, or platforms, close quote. In 2024, in near identical language, the church's statement said that the church, quote, does not endorse, promote, or oppose political parties and their platforms or candidates for political office, close quote. So the church responds to these political controversies with the same neutrality boilerplate every time, regardless of the specific facts or circumstances.
Right, but there's no cease and desist for using the church's name, the likeness of the temple, or the church leaders.
Yeah, 100%. No cease and desist for the implication, the possible confusion, the potential misunderstanding, no trademark claim, no legal action, as far as we can tell, of any instance. So despite repeated escalated uses of the church leaders' images, like you said, Jess, the actual Salt Lake Temple, which strongly implies church endorsement, and using the family proclamation to the world, it's like they just want to continually like cross the lines.
But I can't, Hannah, I can't recall, but there's a specific rule that this is arguably breaking, right?
There is a 2020 Religious News Service column flagged it directly, citing specific handbook sections. So we double checked the current handbook, since it gets renumbered over time, and the substance holds even if the exact numbering has shifted. The church's word mark and symbol are to be used only as approved by church leadership and may not be used in any personal, commercial, or promotional way. Separately, the handbook's political neutrality section says church meetings and settings should not be used for political teaching or advocacy of any kind. And we know
Mm.
that never happens. It's
Oh,
never happened
never.
once, and it never will happen.
Oh, yeah. Because a group called Latter-day Saints for Trump photographed in front of the temple, that's no violation, right? From my perspective, it's way more of a violation than a podcast with the blue light ray logo.
I mean, that's the argument. Now let's talk about the podcast. And this one's yours, Jazz.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so April 17th, 2026, the church and its legal entity, Intellectual Reserve Incorporated, filed a federal trademark and copyright lawsuit against John DeLynn and his Open Stories Foundation over the branding of the Mormon Stories podcast. In fairness to the church, this wasn't the very first move. The reporting indicates the church privately contacted Open Stories Foundation back in November 2025, saying it wanted to resolve the branding concern quietly and amicably before the lawsuit followed months later.
Can you just remind people what the actual complaint is?
Oh, yeah. So the core allegation is that DeLynn's blue logo with light rays in the design and a specific font and color choice, it imitates church marks closely enough to cause public confusion about affiliation.
Mhm.
They also alleged unauthorized use of copyrighted church photographs.
So what did the church actually want as a resolution?
They wanted a brief spoken disclaimer at the start of the episode stating the podcast is, quote, not affiliated with or endorsed by the church. DeLynn declined. He called it disproportionate, saying, quote, it's essentially the primary thing anyone sees in our branding.
Right. And DeLynn, for people who don't know, was excommunicated back in 2015. He filed a big, fat 108-page response, right?
Right, he did. And his core argument is this: Mormon is a generic cultural and religious identifier that no single entity can own, comparable to Christian or Jew. And he points out that the church has itself systematically walked away from the word. Mormon Tabernacle Choir became Tabernacle Choir at Temple Square. Mormon Channel became LDS Channel. Mormon Messages became Inspirational Messages. Mormon.org was retired. Over 1,000 Mormon or LDS branded products were renamed.
The Book of Mormon became the Book of Victory for Satan.
Brilliant. Yeah, and in 2018, for everyone's recollection, Russell M. Nelson told members that using the word Mormon was, quote, a major victory for Satan. And yet, per Delin's filing, the church has continued renewing the same Mormon style trademarks with the U.S. Patent Office the entire time.
So, to be clear, simultaneously, a victory for Satan, to use the word, but it is also a word and trademark that is so worthwhile and necessary to hang on to that you have to actively renew it and sue over it. Okay, all right. So I just want to be clear that those two things exist for the church. Okay, so that's what John DeLynn is pointing at. On June 22nd, 2026, Mormon Stories filed counterclaims seeking cancellation of several church trademark registrations. Because the church wasn't using them anymore. Like Mormon Tabernacle Choir, Mormon Channel, and Mormon Messages on grounds of abandonment, fraud on the USPTO, and genericness.
Yeah. And John DeLynn, he's not the first podcaster that this has happened to, right?
No, Bill Reel of Mormon Discussions and Radio Free Mormon, both of them were separately contacted by Church Legal Counsel in 2025 after trying to trademark their own show names. And back in 2023, the church successfully pushed back on Heather Gay from the Real Housewives of Salt Lake City attempting to trademark Bad Mormon as a memoir title.
So there's a pattern of enforcement against critical or exit narrative content specifically.
Yeah, that is the pattern in the record so far. So to be fair to the church's side, their official getting it right statement frames this as not about viewpoint and not about the word Mormon itself, but about brand confusion specifically. Because, social media comments, look, there's so many of them where users mistook the podcast for official church content and they cite them.
That was probably like
Instagram comments. Yeah, it's like
Anyway.
people who don't know how to use the internet. How you can't factor in for everyone, right? Like, I
Right.
don't
I
know.
mean, in abstract, that's a real concern, right? Because brand confusion is a real legal category.
But yeah, absolutely. And it's worth noting that the legal theory isn't a slam dunk either. Rebecca Tushnet, a Harvard law professor who studies trademark and the First Amendment, has said Mormon Stories likely qualifies as fair use because the name simply truthfully describes the show's content, saying at best, at most, there would be momentary confusion until you opened your ears
You're
and
right.
your eyes.
So even the legal footing under the church's own theory is contested. We're not saying the church's legal theory is frivolous. We're saying hold that legal theory up next to Latter-day Saints for Trump and ask why one gets a federal lawsuit and the other gets a press release.
So again, let's just go back to that spine. Say it out loud. You want to take it or should I?
You've earned it, I think.
Okay, thank you. Yes, here's the tea. The church sued a podcast over a light ray logo and a color palette. Meanwhile, a political coalition literally photographed its leaders in front of the Salt Lake Temple, accidentally and briefly ran images of the actual sitting first presidency next to a presidential candidate, held firesides with that candidate, calling in from Air Force One personally, and cited the church's own proclamation in its mission statement, and received across two full election cycles nothing stronger than a press release level, "We're neutral. Please don't imply otherwise."
Yeah, no cease and desist, no trademark claim, no legal action. So selective enforcement of a brand confusion concern. There's aggressive moves here against a critical exit narrative platform. It's essentially absent, however, against right-aligned political group using the church's actual preferred name, actual photos of the leaders, and actual sacred images of the temple.
And we want to be careful about what we're claiming because we're not lawyers, either of us, even though we both pretend to be on YouTube. We don't have a trademark attorney on record saying LDS for Trump or Latter-day Saints for Trump would legally meet the same likelihood of confusion standard the church is using against Mormon stories. That's the open question, not a settled one.
Right. And it's something that we'll chase down before we'd call this like airtight as a legal matter. But what is settled is the optics and the handbook language. The political neutrality rule exists in some numbered section or another, and it's been sitting right there before any of this.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's very simple and it's a real church playbook. You can state explicitly whatever you want, and there is your plausible deniability. And then the culture is what shapes people. So nobody has to stand at the pulpit and explicitly say something for the message to not be received. The institution has a rule against implying political endorsement and a rule protecting its name and image. So again, it's all about the selective enforcement, right? It enforced one of those rules against a podcast run by an excommunicated critic of the church, and it has not enforced any rules against a group called Latter-day Saints for Trump, waving its temple in the background.
Yeah, that's the double standard. Neutrality gets invoked selectively, and so does brand protection. The pattern lines up along exactly the axis you would expect: harsher on dissent, softer on power.
Which again is not a new story in institutional religion. It's just a very clean and clear, very recent case study. Thank you so much for spending your time with us today. If this episode resonated with you, or even if it didn't, we'd love to hear about it in the comments.
Right. And the easiest way to help other people find us is to leave us a rating and a review wherever you're listening. Even a quick 5-star rating takes like 3 seconds, and it helps us more than you'd think.
Helps us the most. You can find us on Instagram and TikTok at Postmortem Postmortem, online at postmortempostmortem.com, and wherever you are listening to this into your gentle ears. We will link the Jana Reese piece, the lawsuit coverage, and the Latter-day Saints for Trump reporting in the show notes.
We'll be back next week with another episode. Until then, Hannah, I'm sorry for what I said when I was Mormon.
Just like I'm sorry for what I said when I was Mormon too.